this setting right now. The very first event of our campaign for president is an example not only of the way that I wish to campaign across this country for every single American, and I could care less your party persuasion, your religion, anything other than the fact that right now we are all Americans and we are all human beings, and we do everything within our power for one another, for this great country, and for every generation that follows. This is democracy.
Former El Paso Congressman Beto O'Rourke is officially running for president. After much speculation, the candidate announced this morning in a video with his wife, Amy, which coincided with a Vanity Fair cover profile and a trip to Iowa, where he gave his first stump speech in a coffee shop. Now, O'Rourke gained huge national media attention and a devoted national following during his viral candidacy challenging Senator Ted Cruz last year in Texas. He raised more than $70 million, which is a shocking number, and he outperformed any statewide Democrat in Texas in 2 decades. Losing that by less than 3 points, a race many thought that he had no shot at. But lose he did, and for the last several months, he's been road tripping and blogging as he tries to figure out his next move. Now that he's officially part of what's likely to be the largest Democratic field ever, O'Rourke adds a candidacy with a lot of charisma, a built-in fundraising base, but as of now, not a single policy position on his campaign website. To talk about Beto's candidacy and what it means to the 2020 field, I'm joined by Christina Greer, Associate Professor at Fordham University, and John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. Christina, what does this do to the field, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's another Democrat in the field. I mean, as I've said to you, Chris, before in the past few weeks, I mean, we have to be really honest. There are some Democrats who want a straight white male at the top of the ticket. And so this is why we keep hearing about Beto and Biden and Bernie and, you know, before it was Bloomberg. So there are some divisions within the party that are deeper than just, say, progressive versus centrist lines. But, you know, this is a man who, you know, a lot of people want to recreate 2008, which I think would be a mistake because we're currently in 2019. This is a man, though, you know, during one of the greatest crises of the 21st century, you know, with the government shutdown, and you have people literally on bread lines. He's on a walkabout, you know, driving around the country, finding himself, much like he did, you know, when he was in his 20s. So I don't understand. I mean, why are we excited about someone who's very light on policy? I'm sure he has time to get there, but, you know, he's really shown no real gravitas, honestly, with the sort of severity of the moment that we're in 2019. So, I mean, there's much to do about nothing for right now until I see some real policy positions.
John, you wrote a piece today, basically saying run, Beto, run, and more broadly, you said that about Stacey Abrams and other people who are considering. What's your sort of thinking there?
You know, my thinking is that the Democratic field isn't too big. And I'm troubled by the Democrats who say, oh, it's getting so crowded, there's no space for anyone else, as if announcing early settles things that if you didn't announce in the first weeks of 2019, you can't run. What I'm arguing is that I think it's exciting that the field is expanding, and I think it's good. Stacey Abrams indicated this week that she's rethinking. She had sort of taken herself out of the running. Now she's suggesting that she might make the race. I think her addition would be electric and important. There's some talk of Andrew Gillum thinking about it as well. He's going to make an announcement on March 20th. I'm not sure if he's going to run, but I think that also is an expression of a sense that this race can use more people. And with Beto O'Rourke, obviously he got in today. I don't disagree with some of these criticisms. I think that he has to do a much better job of defining himself and saying, you know, why he's there, why he is, quote unquote, needed in this race. But I will tell you, as somebody that covered the Texas race in 2018, I was powerfully struck by many of the innovations that he brought to our politics. And so I think that keep an eye on him, because my sense is that what he will bring to this race is hopefully policy stances, which are much clearer, but also a different way of campaigning. And I do think people are open to that.
You know, that campaign really was a remarkably built machine in a lot of ways, just in terms of the amount of travel it did, the fundraising, the sort of the miles covered. As to the sort of policy and discernmency, I thought this answered the question about Medicare for all today that he got. His first day on the trail was pretty interesting. This is in Iowa in a radio interview. Listen what he had to say.
Medicare for all is championed by some of your new competitors.
Right.
You get asked about it how quickly are you going to promise voters that you get there?
I'm convinced that we will have to work from as much common ground as possible. No one person and perhaps no one party can force the decision on this. This has to be something that America comes together on.
You know, Christina, at one level, that's a very that's a very evasive answer. He does not take a position. But one of the things I have noticed, and you referenced 2008, there is a constituency of Democratic voters who really like, particularly in polarized times, particularly in the era of Trump, and they felt this way at the end of Bush, talk of unity, talk of coming together, talk of coming to finding consensus. That is a powerful message among Democratic primary voters. It has been in the past.
Oh, indeed. And, you know, listen, I think unity is one message. But here's the thing, Chris. We need someone who understands not just the candidate phase, right, but the governance phase as well. And I'm not sold on that. I mean, the answers I've heard from Beto thus far are middle of the road, which, keep in mind, not every Democrat is a progressive. So there is space. Yes. I think there's space definitely for Stacey Abrams, but there's space for a lot more Democrats because we have a myriad of divisions within the party that, you know, hopefully someone can sort of thread that needle and sort of join the Democrats from across the country. However, when you really listen to what he is saying a series of nouns and verbs, but no real policy positions. I mean, that was a statement that honestly anyone could have made, not a three-term congressman who is actually thinking about the presidency. So yes, it is early. However, he has had, you know, several months when he was running against Ted Cruz to really sharpen some of these ideas. And I think I'm a little surprised that so many journalists and podcast folks are super excited about him when there's so many other, I would argue, more qualified individuals who have yet to jump in, but just don't have the excitement behind them for a host of probably demographic reasons.
One of the questions, John, to me is just in a sort of a political sense, not in terms of some sort of substance sense, is whether the fundraising machine that he built during the Texas campaign, which was the most remarkable fundraising machine anyone has ever built for a midterm election ever. I mean, $70 million is just a shocking number. Whether he can rebuild that, because as we go forward and with a crowded field, a big thing that's going to determine how long people can stay in this race and how deep they go is whether they have that kind of fundraising base.
So the answer to your question is no. And I don't want to, pop anybody's balloon here, but a substantial portion of the success of that fundraising back in 2018 was the fact that he was running against Ted Cruz.
Right.
And there are just an awful lot of people in America who want to get Ted Cruz out of the Senate for whatever reason, in whatever way possible, including a lot of Republicans.
Yeah.
And so the notion that he's going to recreate that fundraising, I'm dubious about. I would also say that with answers like that Medicare for All answer, no, that wasn't very inspiring. Well, he did today, though. I'll note one thing that's significant. I think it was the same interview, he was asked about the death penalty, and he came out very strongly, very clearly in absolute opposition.
Interesting.
And so we will see. He does have to take clear stands. If he does, it'll help a lot. But the important thing to understand is that the fundraising thing, it will be different this time. What I think was more significant about the O'Rourke campaign in 2018 was the decentralizing of the campaign, the use of pop-up offices and things like that. I think that was underemphasized, whereas the fundraising was somewhat overemphasized.
I should note that Kamala Harris called for a death penalty moratorium today as well in the wake of Gavin Newsom instituting one in the state of California. Christina Greer and John Nichols, thank you both. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.